first two questions, and I have no sense of this. If I took 1,000 people from this HMSA database and sent them a questionnaire to ask them about their spam consumption, and what someone just told me, Chad, said that this is a large, almost monopoly of the population in Hawaii, then my 1,000 people might be a random sample of 1,000 typical Hawaiians. Now, how many of those thousands do you think would say, yes, they ate spam a lot? Now, I have no sense of whether whether this is an urban myth or not, whether spam is considered a, a desired food commodity in Hawaii or not. So just a few people send in your guesses. Out of 1,000 people, what percent of those would you say would be serious spam eaters, whatever serious is in your mind? So send in a number. Gabe said, I had some with my fried rice this morning. Okay. Patrick said 10%. Gabe said 65%. Anybody else want to vote on this? This is not a good test for attentionness because I don't know how many other people are paying attention. This is actually good news. If the answer is 40, 50, 60%, that means when I enroll 1,000 people at random, I'm going to have a good number of spam users and a good number of non-spam users. But on the other hand, if Cecilia's right, only 10% of them are spam users. That means asking 1,000 people about spam eating habits is only going to give me 100 spam eaters and 900 non-spam eaters. And that might not be enough. 100 spam consumers might not be a big enough number to put into a group to compare an outcome, namely diabetes, cardiovascular disease, with the non-spam users. So really what I'd like to have is a large enough number of people in these different groups I'm going to be comparing. And there are two ways of doing that. This design said, let's take a random sample, 1,000 people, and let them fall into the categories themselves. Hopefully we'll get enough people in each of the spam group and the non-spam group. Another option, which I think was study design number 3 or 2, was actually go out and try to find high-risk group, a high prevalence of spam group. In other words, Kiabe says McDonald's doesn't sell anything they don't make money on. Okay, and Burger King, and so people are mentioning that Burger King and McDonald's are one place where you'll find people eating spam. So if you want to do a study that to get enough spam users with the least amount of trouble, maybe you should do a study where you go to people who are eating at McDonald's, enroll them in your study. And therefore, you hope to get lots of spam eaters. So the target population may in part be driven by the quality of the data, and I think that's why you use this HMSA data set, because it's going to contain claims data. But maybe those people, 1,000, might not be enough to get a sufficient sample size in these two groups that you want to enroll, spam users into non-spam users. And it's hard for me to talk and read at the same time, but I'm getting some interesting comments about you guys about spam. Okay, next question. What other information would you put in this survey? First of all, it's going to be hard to ask, think of the right questions to ask about spam consumption. Would it be how much spam, how many cans do you open a week, or how often do you eat spam? But besides spam, this bullet is saying, what other information do you want to record? And anybody have any ideas of what they're going to want to ask in addition to the spam use? Because once you get this questionnaire in the mail, you have the opportunity to ask people other things besides just their spam consumption. You don't want to make it too long, because then people won't bother to fill it out. But you want to take advantage of this window of opportunity. So one person said, let's ask about what else they eat. That's very good. If what else they eat are risk factors, a diet high in fat, a diet high in salt might be risk factors for developing cardiovascular disease. So definitely I'd like to know something about their overall diet. I'd like to collect information on anything that I feel could be a potential confounder, something we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. Gabby mentioned a confounder has to have two characteristics. It has to be related to the outcome. And the outcomes are things like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, hypertension. And it also has to be related to the diet of spam use. We'll talk about those two criteria later. But what I'm thinking about now is if I have to adjust for these confounders in the analysis, I'm going to need information about these confounders in my data set. Now, if the data is already collected as part of the claims data set, then I'm covered. So the claims data set is going to have your age in it. It's going to have your sex recorded. So I don't have to ask people about their age and sex. But I'm thinking about what's not in the claims data. And things like diet are very useful information that's not part of the claims data set. Smoking habits is probably something you want to record if that has something to do with the risk of developing cardiovascular disease. And another piece of information I'd be very interested in recording is information about these outcomes that I want to measure in the future. I want to know whether you already have diabetes. I want to know if you've already been diagnosed with hypertension in the past, if you've been diagnosed with a stroke or a cerebrovascular disease or coronary heart disease in the past. I should have that information in the claims data set. But this would be a check on the validity of the information in the claims data set. If I get different answers, if you say you are a diabetic, the claims data set has no record of you ever being diagnosed with diabetes, then the question is which one is correct? There's a lot, and then we have to worry about which data set we use. But I'd like to collect that other information also, because remember, I want to exclude from my data set people who have already been diagnosed with these outcomes, because I want to measure risk of developing outcomes in the future. Kiabe says Native Hawaiians in the traditional mode of cultivation eat more spam because it's traditional food, along with poi. Yeah, I mean, so if you can work in your 10 questions that you had for your groupings in your previous study into this survey, that would be great to have. The idea is you want to take advantage of this opportunity. But if you make it too long, a survey is probably not going to be completed. If people don't complete it, then you run this selection bias problem that we talked about before. But the people who respond to your survey could be different than people who don't respond to your survey. Well, those were just some questions to think about when you think about cohort studies. Let me just end by moving into the last study we'll talk about today. I mentioned there are two types of cohort studies, prospective cohort studies and retrospective cohort studies. Both of them are cohort studies. The difference is, when does the follow-up occur among these people? When are the outcomes recorded? So the previous study we just looked at was what we call a prospective study. Prospective, if I go back to that diagram, in that I'm enrolling people today, recording from the survey whether they're spam users or non-spam users. I'm going to follow those people during the year 2010, 2009, 2010, for the next 5 years to see who develops coronary heart disease, who develops diabetes. All these outcomes happen after the study began. All the follow-up happens after today. That's what we mean by a prospective design. Alternatively, a retrospective design is one that's based on previously collected data, historical data, data that was collected for a different purpose. So, for example, I could go back to that HMSA data set, and I could figure out which people were, say, what would I have? I could know who was diabetic and who was not diabetic 10 years ago. I might have information on race ethnic groups. I might know people 10 years ago in this HMSA data set, who were Native Hawaiians versus who were Caucasians, who were Filipinos. I could then take those people and follow them through the years, through the late 1990s, through the early part of this century, to see who developed coronary heart disease, who developed diabetes. So there what would be happening, I would be using previously collected data, historical data. It was collected for an entirely different purpose, not for answering a question, does one racial ethnic group have a higher incidence of developing diabetes than another? But I'd follow them up, record these outcomes as part of that data set. I'd be recording things that already happened to people in the past. And that's what I mean by a retrospective cohort study. To try to give you an example of it, one of the studies that I've asked you to read also was one by Deborah Sierra, is that how you pronounce her last name, using that data from that same health claims data set, doing a retrospective cohort study. And basically what she did is she enrolled